Sarah walked into the shooting range with her head held high, but her hands were shaking slightly. The smell of gunpowder and cleaning oil filled the air as she approached the counter. Behind her, she could hear the muffled sounds of gunshots from the indoor ranges. The clerk at the counter looked up from his paperwork. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes. "First time here?" he asked, glancing at Sarah's small frame and casual clothes. "Yes," Sarah replied softly. "I'd like to rent a lane for an hour, please." The man nodded and slid a clipboard across the counter. "Fill this out. Any experience with firearms?" Sarah hesitated for a moment. "Some," she said simply. As she filled out the paperwork, she noticed 3 men at a nearby table cleaning their guns. They were loud and confident, wearing tactical gear that looked expensive. Their conversation carried across the room. "Look at that," one of them said, nodding towards Sarah. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a buzz cut. Another weekend warrior, thinking she can handle a real gun. His friends chuckled. The second man, shorter but stocky, shook his head. "Bet she's here because her boyfriend told her to learn. Probably thinks she can protect herself with a little .22. The third man, who had a thick beard and wore a military-style cap, grinned. $20, says she can't hit the target from 7 yards. Sarah pretended not to hear them as she handed back the paperwork. The clerk gave her a key and pointed toward lane 15. "That's your spot. Need any safety equipment?" "I have my own," Sarah said, patting the small bag she carried. As she walked toward her lane, the 3 men watched her go. The tall one with the buzz cut stood up and called out, "Hey, miss, you sure you don't want to start with the kiddie range? We got some cork guns in the back." His friends burst into laughter. Sarah stopped walking, but didn't turn around. She could feel her face getting hot with embarrassment and anger. "Leave her alone, Mike," the clerk said from behind the counter, but his voice lacked any real authority. "Just being helpful," Mike replied with a smirk. "Don't want anyone getting hurt because they bit off more than they can chew." Sarah continued to her lane without responding. She set her bag down on the small shelf and began unpacking her equipment. Her ear protection was military grade, not the cheap plastic kind most casual shooters used. Her shooting glasses were professional quality. From her bag, she pulled out a case. Inside was a Glock 19, well-maintained and familiar. The weight of it in her hands felt right, like shaking hands with an old friend. The 3 men had moved to lanes nearby, apparently wanting to get a good view of what they expected to be entertainment. Mike was in lane 12, the stocky one named Dave was in 13, and the bearded man called Pete had taken lane 14. "What do you think she's got there?" Dave asked loudly, making no effort to hide his conversation. "Looks like she spent some money on it, at least." "Probably Daddy's gun," Pete said, loading his own pistol. "Rich girl playing dress-up." Sarah clipped the target to the line and sent it out to 25 yards. This drew more attention from the men. 25 yards. Mike laughed. "Honey, you might want to bring that in a little closer. Most people start at 7 yards for a reason." Sarah put on her ear protection and ignored them. She took her shooting stance, and for the first time since entering the range, she felt completely calm. Her breathing slowed, her hands steadied, and everything else faded away. The first shot rang out, then the second, then the third. She fired 10 rounds in quick succession, each shot deliberate and controlled. When she was done, she pressed the button to bring the target back. The men had stopped talking. They watched as the target came back down the line towards Sarah. When it arrived, even from their positions, they could see the tight grouping in the center of the target. All 10 shots were clustered in the 10 ring, with most of them touching each other. "Lucky shots," Mike said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. Dave squinted at the target. "That's actually pretty good grouping." Pete was quiet, studying Sarah more carefully now. Something about the way she handled her weapon, the way she stood, was familiar to him. He'd served in the Army for 8 years before getting out, and he recognized certain things. Sarah sent the target out again, this time to 50 yards. The maximum distance for the indoor range. 50 yards, Dave said. "Come on, that's just showing off now." Sarah loaded another magazine. This time she took her time, settling into a rhythm. She fired slowly, deliberately. Each shot was a conversation between her and the target. When she brought the target back, the result was even more impressive. At 50 yards, she had maintained a grouping that most people couldn't achieve at 25. The range had gotten quieter. Other shooters were starting to notice. Word was spreading among the regulars that someone was putting on a show in lane 15. Mike wasn't laughing anymore. "Okay, that's actually impressive," he admitted grudgingly. Dave nodded. "Yeah, I couldn't do that." But Pete was studying something else. As Sarah reached up to clip a new target to the line, her sleeve had ridden up slightly. On her forearm, he caught a glimpse of black ink. It looked like part of a tattoo, but from his angle, he couldn't make out what it was. Sarah continued shooting, seemingly oblivious to the attention she was drawing. With each target, her groupings remained tight and precise. She moved through different distances and different shooting positions with the kind of fluid skill that only came from serious training. The mockery had stopped completely now. The three men were shooting their own targets, but they kept glancing over at Sarah's lane. Other people in the range were doing the same. "I think we might have judged her wrong," Dave said quietly to his friends. Mike nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think you're right." But Pete was still focused on that glimpse of tattoo he'd seen. Something about it nagged at him. He'd seen a lot of military tattoos over the years, and there was something specific about the style and placement that seemed familiar. As Sarah finished her first hour and went to the counter to extend her time, Pete made a decision. He was going to find out more about this mysterious woman who had just schooled them all at their own game. The clerk looked impressed as he processed Sarah's payment for another hour. "You shoot competitively?" he asked. "Sometimes," Sarah replied, her voice still soft and humble. "Well, you're certainly good at it," the clerk said. "Best shooting I've seen in here in a long time." Sarah smiled slightly and headed back to her lane. She didn't notice Pete watching her carefully, trying to get a better look at whatever was on her arm. As she unpacked her equipment again, Pete casually moved closer. He pretended to be checking something at the ammunition counter, but his real goal was to get a better view. Sarah was focused on her gun, checking and cleaning it between shooting sessions. As she worked, her sleeve shifted again, and Pete got a clearer look at her forearm. What he saw made him freeze. It wasn't just any military tattoo. It was something specific, something that told a story about who this quiet woman really was. And if Pete was right about what he was seeing, then he and his friends had just made a very big mistake. Pete stood there for a long moment, staring. His mind was racing, trying to process what he was seeing and what it meant. It had to be wrong. There was no way this small, quiet woman could be what that tattoo suggested she was. But as he watched her handle her weapon with the kind of professional competence that couldn't be faked, he began to realize that maybe his first impression had been completely wrong. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Sarah loaded another magazine and prepared for her next round of shooting, completely unaware that she had just revealed something that would change everything. The afternoon at the shooting range was about to become much more interesting than anyone had expected. Pete's hands trembled slightly as he pretended to examine boxes of ammunition on the counter. His eyes kept darting back to Sarah's forearm, hoping to get another glimpse of what he thought he'd seen. The tattoo had been partially visible, but the part he'd seen was unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. It was the trident, the Navy SEAL emblem. Pete had served alongside SEALs during his deployment in Afghanistan. He knew that tattoo, knew what it meant, and knew how few people had the right to wear it. But seeing it on this quiet woman didn't make sense. Women hadn't been allowed in the SEALs when he was in the service. Things had changed since then, but still. "Pete, you okay?" Dave asked, noticing his friend's strange behavior. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Pete muttered, still watching Sarah. Mike joined them at the ammunition counter. "What's going on? Why are we whispering?" Pete glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. "That woman over there. I think she might be military." "So?" Mike shrugged. "Lots of people in the military know how to shoot. That doesn't explain why she's so good." "Not just military," Pete said quietly. "I think she might be special forces." Dave laughed. "Come on, Pete. I know you want to feel better about getting shown up, but that's a pretty big leap. Look at her tattoo, Pete insisted. Mike and Dave both tried to get a casual look, but Sarah's sleeve had fallen back down, covering her forearm completely. I don't see any tattoo, Mike said. It's covered now, but I saw it. Part of it, anyway. Pete's voice was getting more urgent. Guys, I think that might be a seal trident. The other two men stared at him in disbelief. That's impossible, Dave said. Women aren't seals. There now, Pete replied. The program opened up a few years ago, and even before that, there were women in other special operations units. Mike shook his head. You're seeing things, man. There's no way that quiet little librarian-looking woman is some kind of elite soldier. Then explain her shooting, Pete challenged. Explain how she's hitting tight groups at 50 yards like it's nothing. Explain why she handles that gun like it's part of her body. Sarah continued her practice, oblivious to the debate she was causing. She had moved on to different drills now, practicing quick target acquisition and multiple target engagement. Her movements were smooth and practiced like someone who had done these exercises thousands of times. She's doing failure drills, Pete observed, his voice getting quieter as he realized what he was watching. Failure drills? Dave asked. Mozambique drill. 2 to the body, 1 to the head. It's advanced combat shooting technique. Pete watched as Sarah executed the drill perfectly, repeatedly. That's not something you learn in a weekend course. Mike was starting to look less certain. Okay, so maybe she's more experienced than we thought. Maybe she's been shooting competitively for years. Competitive shooters don't train like that, Pete said. That's military training. Combat training. As if to prove his point, Sarah began a new exercise. She was practicing shooting while moving, stepping side to side between shots while maintaining accuracy. It was a technique used for engaging targets while under fire. Other people in the range were starting to notice too. The range safety officer, a retired police sergeant named Bill, had positioned himself where he could watch Sarah's lane. He'd been running ranges for 15 years, and he'd never seen shooting like this from a civilian. I should introduce myself, Pete said suddenly. What? What? Mike asked. If she's what I think she is, then we owe her an apology. A big one. Pete started walking towards Sarah's lane before his friends could stop him. Sarah was reloading when she noticed someone approaching her lane. She looked up to see one of the men who had been making jokes about her earlier. He was walking slowly, his hands visible, in the universal gesture of someone who didn't want to be seen as threatening. Excuse me, Pete said, stopping at a respectful distance. I'm better. I wanted to apologize for earlier. My friends and I were out of line. Sarah studied him for a moment. Up close, she could see the military bearing in his posture, the way he carried himself. It's fine, she said simply. No, it's not fine, Pete continued. We made assumptions, and we were wrong. Very wrong, I think. Sarah's expression didn't change, but Pete noticed her hand move slightly closer to her weapon. It was a subtle movement, probably unconscious, but it told him she was assessing potential threats. It was exactly what he would do in an unfamiliar situation. I serve in Afghanistan, Pete said. Army, 8 years. I worked with some special operations units during my deployment. Now Sarah's expression did change slightly. Her eyes sharpened, and Pete could see her evaluating him differently. Thank you for your service, she said, but her voice was still guarded. I couldn't help but notice your technique, Pete continued. It's very professional. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was clearly deciding how much to reveal about herself. I've had some training, she said finally. Pete nodded. I can see that. The kind of training most people don't get access to. There was a long pause. Sarah seemed to be weighing her options, deciding whether this conversation was worth having. What exactly are you asking, she said. I'm not asking anything, Pete replied. I'm just saying that if you are who I think you might be, then my friends and I made a very serious mistake earlier, and I want to make that right. Sarah looked past Pete to where Mike and Dave were standing at the ammunition counter, clearly trying to eavesdrop on the conversation. Your friends look nervous, she observed. Pete glanced back at them. They should be. I told them what I think your tattoo means. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her forearm, covering the area where her tattoo was hidden beneath her sleeve. "You saw that?" she asked. "Just a piece of it. Enough to recognize the style." Pete's voice was respectful now, almost reverent. "If I'm right, then you've earned respect that we failed to give you." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying Pete's face. She was clearly making a decision about something. "What unit were you with?" she asked. 10th Mountain Division, attached to various Special Operations Unit for transportation and logistic support. Sarah nodded slowly. She seemed to recognize the unit. "Afghanistan or Iraq?" she asked. "Afghanistan. 3 tours between 2010 and 2016. Kandahar. Some of the time, yes." Sarah's expression softened slightly. They had shared battlefields, if not at the same time. "You said your friends are nervous," Sarah said. "What did you tell them exactly?" Pete hesitated. "I told them I thought you might be a SEAL." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah's expression gave nothing away, but Pete could see her thinking carefully about how to respond. "What made you think that?" she asked. "The shooting, the movement, the way you handle your weapon. But mostly the tattoo. I only got a glimpse, but I've seen enough SEAL tridents to recognize one." Sarah looked around the range. Other people were still watching her, though they were trying to be discreet about it. Her exceptional shooting had drawn attention, and now this conversation was drawing even more. "This isn't really the place for this discussion," she said. Pete nodded. "You're right. I just wanted to apologize and to let you know that we understand we were wrong." "Apology accepted," Sarah said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some more practice to finish." Pete started to walk away, then turned back. "For what it's worth, that's some of the best shooting I've ever seen, professional or otherwise." "Thank you," Sarah said, and for the first time since Pete had approached her, she smiled slightly. Pete walked back to his friends, who immediately crowded around him. "Well," Mike asked eagerly, "what did she say?" "She didn't confirm or deny anything," Pete said. "But she didn't have to. Everything about her screams special operations." Dave looked skeptical. "So what if she is? What does that change? What does it change?" Pete stared at his friend in disbelief. "Dave, if that woman is a Navy SEAL, she's part of the most elite military unit in the world. She's been through training that would break most men. She's probably seen combat in places we can't even imagine. And we mocked her like she was some kind of amateur." Mike was beginning to look uncomfortable. "Okay, so maybe we were jerks. But we didn't know." "That's exactly the point," Pete said. "We didn't know, but we made assumptions anyway. We saw a small woman and decided she couldn't be serious about shooting. We never considered that maybe she had more experience than all of us combined." As they talked, Sarah continued her practice. But now she was doing something different. Instead of the precision shooting she'd been doing before, she was running combat scenarios, moving and shooting, engaging multiple targets, practicing reloads under stress. It was a display of tactical shooting that left no doubt about her level of training. "Holy shit," Dave whispered, watching her work. "Pete's right. That's not normal shooting. That's military." Mike nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think we might have really screwed up here." But their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the front of the range. Someone was coming through the door, and from the reaction of the staff, it was someone important. The range manager himself had come out from his office to greet the newcomer personally. They spoke briefly, and then the manager pointed toward the shooting lanes. The newcomer was a tall man in his 50s, wearing civilian clothes, but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. He had gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. As he walked through the range, other shooters stopped what they were doing to watch him pass. He was heading straight for Sarah's lane. Pete felt his stomach drop. If this man was who Pete thought he might be, then the situation was about to become very complicated indeed. The entire shooting range seemed to hold its breath as the tall man approached Sarah's lane. His presence commanded attention without him saying a word. Other shooters stopped mid-reload to watch him pass. Even the staff members paused their work to observe. Sarah was focused on her target, preparing for another drill sequence, when she noticed the reflection in her shooting glasses. Someone was standing behind her lane. She finished her current magazine, set her weapon down safely, and turned around. When she saw who was standing there, her entire demeanor changed instantly. Her relaxed civilian posture disappeared, replaced by something much more formal. "Commander Morrison," she said, her voice carrying a tone of respect that Pete and his friends had never heard from her. The gray-haired man smiled slightly. "Hello, Sarah. Mind if I interrupt your practice session?" "Of course not, sir." Sarah immediately began securing her weapon and clearing her lane. Pete, Mike, and Dave watched from their positions 3 lanes over, trying to process what they were seeing. The quiet woman who had been the target of their mockery was clearly showing deference to this newcomer, and it was the kind of deference that only existed in military hierarchies. "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by," Commander Morrison said. The range manager mentioned there was someone here putting on quite a demonstration. "Just maintaining proficiency, sir," Sarah replied. "From what I'm told, proficiency might be an understatement." The commander gestured toward her targets, several of which were still hanging on the line, showing tight groupings that would impress professional instructors. Pete nudged Dave and whispered urgently, "That's a Navy commander. See the way she's acting around him? That's not just respect for a superior officer. That's respect for someone in her direct chain of command." Dave's eyes widened. "You think he's her boss?" "I think he's her commanding officer," Pete corrected. "And if I'm right about what that means..." Mike, who had been listening to their whispered conversation, suddenly looked very pale. "Guys, I think we need to get out of here." But it was too late to leave without drawing attention. Commander Morrison had noticed them watching and seemed to be evaluating the 3 men with the same sharp eyes he'd used to assess the rest of the range. "Sarah," the commander said, "I understand you've met some of the other shooters here today." Sarah glanced toward Pete, Mike, and Dave. "Yes, sir." Briefly. "I see." The commander's voice carried the weight of someone who was used to getting complete information with minimal words. "And how did that interaction go?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment. "There was some initial confusion about my experience level, sir." Pete felt his stomach sink. Even though Sarah was being diplomatic, it was clear that the commander was reading between the lines. "Initial confusion," Commander Morrison repeated slowly. "I see." He turned to look directly at the 3 men, and Pete felt like he was being evaluated by a very experienced predator deciding whether he was worth the effort to hunt. "Gentlemen," the commander said, his voice carrying clearly across the lanes, "would you mind joining us for a moment?" It wasn't really a request. Pete, Mike, and Dave exchanged glances and realized they had no choice but to walk over to Sarah's lane. As they approached, Pete could see Sarah's tattoo more clearly now. Her sleeve had ridden up during her shooting, and the full seal trident was visible on her forearm. But now he could see other details too. Below the trident were dates and what looked like location names. Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia. This wasn't just someone who had made it through SEAL training. This was someone who had seen combat deployments in multiple theaters. "I'm Commander Morrison," the gray-haired man said as the 3 men reached Sarah's lane. "And you are?" "Pete Williams, sir. Former Army, 10th Mountain Division." "Dave Rodriguez, sir. Civilian." "Mike Thompson, sir. Also civilian." Commander Morrison nodded acknowledgement, but his expression remained neutral. "I understand there was some confusion about Sarah's experience level when she arrived here today." Pete felt sweat forming on his forehead. "Yes, sir. We made some assumptions that were incorrect." "What kind of assumptions?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Pete realized that this was his opportunity to either own up to their behavior or try to minimize it. Looking at the commander's steady gaze, he knew that only complete honesty would be acceptable. "We assumed she was inexperienced because of her appearance, sir. We made jokes about her abilities before we'd seen her shoot." "I see." The commander's expression didn't change, but somehow the temperature in the area seemed to drop several degrees. "And what was the nature of these jokes?" Mike stepped forward, apparently deciding to take responsibility. "Sir, we suggested she should use the kiddie range. We made bets about whether she could hit targets at close range. We were completely out of line." "Yes, you were." The commander's voice was quiet, but it carried absolute authority. Do any of you know who Sarah is? The three men shook their heads. Sarah is Petty Officer, First Class Sarah Chun, United States Navy SEALs. She graduated from BUD/S training 18 months ago, making her part of the first class to include women in the SEAL program. She has completed 2 combat deployments, one to Afghanistan and one to Somalia. She holds expert marksmanship ratings with 7 different weapon systems and has been recommended for promotion to Chief Petty Officer. The silence that followed was deafening. Pete felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Dave and Mike looked like they wanted to disappear entirely. Furthermore, Commander Morrison continued, Petty Officer Chun was recently awarded the Bronze Star with V device for valor during a hostage rescue operation in Somalia. She single-handedly eliminated 4 enemy combatants while under fire and saved the lives of 3 captured aid workers. Sarah's face remained impassive, but Pete could see slight discomfort at having her service record discussed so publicly. Sir, Pete said, his voice barely above a whisper, we had no idea. Of course you didn't, the commander replied, because you made judgments based on appearances rather than giving her the respect that any person deserves when they walk into a place of business. He turned to look at each of the 3 men in turn. Petty Officer Chun could have revealed her background at any time today. She could have put you in your place immediately. Instead, she chose to simply demonstrate her abilities and let her performance speak for itself. That's the mark of a professional. Pete felt ashamed in a way he hadn't experienced since his drill sergeant had dressed him down during basic training. Sir, we would like to apologize. You can apologize, the commander said. But understand that your behavior today reflects poorly not just on yourselves, but on all veterans. Petty Officer Chun is a fellow service member who has served her country with distinction, and she deserved better treatment from people who should understand the value of military service. Dave stepped forward. Sir, what can we do to make this right? Commander Morrison looked at Sarah. That's not my decision to make. The apology you owe is to Petty Officer Chun, not to me. The 3 men turned to face Sarah, who had remained silent during the entire exchange. Pete could see that she was still holding herself in the formal military posture she'd adopted when the commander arrived. Petty Officer Chun, Pete began, we sincerely apologize for our behavior today. We made assumptions that were wrong and disrespectful. We're sorry for the way we treated you, and we're grateful that you chose to handle the situation with such professionalism. Mike and Dave nodded their agreement. We're truly sorry, Mike added. We have no excuse for how we acted. Sarah studied them for a moment, then relaxed slightly. Apology accepted, she said. We all make mistakes. The important thing is learning from them. Commander Morrison nodded approvingly. Well said, Petty Officer Chun. He turned back to the 3 men. Gentlemen, I hope you'll remember this experience the next time you're tempted to make assumptions about someone based on their appearance. Excellence comes in many forms, and it's not always obvious at first glance. Yes, sir, all 3 men replied. The commander looked around the range, which had gradually returned to normal activity as the conversation continued. Sarah, how much more practice time did you have planned? I reserved the lane for 2 hours total, sir. I have about 30 minutes remaining. Good. I'd like to observe your training, if you don't mind. It's been a while since I've seen the results of the new training protocols in action. Of course, sir, Sarah replied. As she began setting up for another drill sequence, Commander Morrison turned to Pete, Mike, and Dave. Gentlemen, you're welcome to stay and observe as well. You might learn something. It was clearly a dismissal, but also an opportunity. Pete realized that they were being given a chance to see exactly what kind of warrior they had underestimated. Thank you, sir, Pete said. We'd be honored to watch. As Sarah prepared her equipment for the demonstration, Pete couldn't help but wonder what they were about to see. If her previous shooting had been impressive, what would she do when she was performing for her commanding officer? He was about to find out that everything they had witnessed so far had been Sarah holding back. Her real capabilities were something else entirely. Sarah began setting up equipment that Pete hadn't seen her use before. From her bag, she pulled out additional magazines, a shot timer, and what appeared to be a more advanced target system. This wasn't going to be casual practice anymore. What you've observed so far, Commander Morrison said to the three men, has been basic marksmanship maintenance. What you're about to see is tactical proficiency training. The range around them had grown quiet again. Word was spreading that something special was happening at Lane 15. Even shooters from the rifle range upstairs had come down to watch. Sarah clipped multiple targets to her line at varying distances, 7 yards, 15 yards, 25 yards, and the maximum 50 yards. But these weren't standard bullseye targets. They were silhouette targets with specific scoring zones marked for vital areas. This is a combat effectiveness drill, Commander Morrison explained to the watching crowd. The scenario simulates a hostile environment with multiple threats at various distances, requiring immediate neutralization. Sarah loaded 3 magazines with different color tape markers. She set the shot timer for a specific sequence and took her position. Her civilian demeanor had completely disappeared now. In its place stood a warrior preparing for simulated combat. Beginning hostage rescue scenario, she announced in a clear, professional voice. The timer beeped, and Sarah exploded into motion. Her first target was the closest threat, 7 yards. 2 shots to center mass, then immediately transitioning to the 15-yard target. The sound of her shots was rhythmic, controlled, but incredibly fast. Each shot was deliberate, but the time between shots was minimal. Pete watched in amazement as she engaged all 4 targets in sequence, then executed a tactical reload that took less than 2 seconds. Her movements were fluid, practiced, and absolutely precise. Hostage target, Commander Morrison called out, and Sarah immediately adjusted her fire to engage a target that had appeared between 2 of the threat targets. This required precision shooting that would avoid hitting friendly targets while still neutralizing the threat. The shot was perfect, center mass on the threat target with no damage to the surrounding hostage targets. Multiple threats, close quarters, the commander announced, and Sarah immediately transitioned to a different drill. She began moving laterally while engaging targets, simulating combat movement under fire. Her footwork was precise, maintaining balance and accuracy while constantly changing position. Dave whispered to Mike, "I've never seen shooting like this outside of movies." But this wasn't movie choreography. This was real, tactical shooting, the kind that kept people alive in combat situations. Sarah executed a series of drills that demonstrated not just marksmanship, but combat tactics. She practiced shooting from cover, engaging targets while protecting herself behind barriers. She demonstrated shooting from unconventional positions, prone, on her back from behind obstacles. Ammunition conservation drill, Commander Morrison announced. Now Sarah had to engage multiple targets with limited ammunition, forcing her to make every shot count under time pressure. She had 6 rounds to neutralize 4 targets at varying distances. Miss 1 shot, and she would fail the drill. The timer started, and Sarah engaged each target with calculated precision. 6 shots, 4 targets down, with 2 rounds left as backup. She had achieved what most shooters would struggle to do with twice the ammunition. Malfunction drill, the commander called out. Sarah immediately simulated a weapon malfunction, executing immediate action procedures to clear the jam and return to firing. Her hands moved with muscle memory, clearing the malfunction and continuing to engage targets without breaking rhythm. Pete realized he was watching someone who had trained these procedures until they became automatic responses. This wasn't just shooting, this was combat preparation. Low light engagement, Commander Morrison announced, and the range lights were dimmed to simulate twilight conditions. Sarah switched to using her weapon's night sights, engaging targets in reduced visibility. Her accuracy remained unchanged despite the challenging conditions. "Sir," Pete said quietly to Commander Morrison, "how long does it take to develop skills like this?" "Years," the commander replied. The basic SEAL training program is 24 weeks of the most intense military training in the world. Only about 20% of candidates complete it. But that's just the beginning. Tactical shooting training continues throughout a SEAL's career. Petty Officer Chen practices these drills several times a week. Sarah had moved on to stress shooting drills now. She was engaging targets while performing physical stress, burpees, sprints, elevated heart rate conditions. The idea was to simulate the physiological stress of combat and maintain accuracy under those conditions. Even while breathing hard and with an elevated heart rate from physical exertion, her shots remained grouped tightly in the target's vital zones. "Combat reload under fire," the commander called out. Sarah dropped to cover behind a barrier, executed a tactical reload, and returned to firing. The entire sequence took less than 4 seconds. Mike shook his head in disbelief. "We made fun of her," he said quietly. "We actually made fun of someone who could probably take out all 3 of us before we knew what was happening." "That's not the point," Pete replied. "The point is that she's been trained to protect people like us. She's put her life on the line for the country, and we treated her like a joke." The demonstration continued for 20 more minutes. Sarah ran through scenarios that covered every aspect of tactical shooting: urban combat, close quarters battle, long-range precision, rapid target acquisition, shooting on the move, and combat in confined spaces. When she finally set down her weapon and called "cease fire," the entire range burst into applause. It was spontaneous and genuine. People who had never seen professional tactical shooting before expressing their appreciation for the display of skill they had just witnessed. Sarah removed her ear protection and turned to face Commander Morrison. "Drill complete, sir. Ready for evaluation." "Outstanding work, Petty Officer Chun. That was exactly the level of proficiency I expect from our team members." He turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just witnessed is the result of the finest military training in the world, executed by one of our nation's elite warriors. Petty Officer Chun represents the best of the United States Navy SEALs." The applause continued, and Sarah stood at attention, accepting the recognition with professional dignity. Commander Morrison approached Pete, Mike, and Dave. "Gentlemen, I trust this has been educational." "Yes, sir," Pete replied. "We understand now what we failed to see earlier." "More importantly," the commander said, "I hope you understand that excellence doesn't announce itself. Some of the most capable people you'll ever meet are also the most humble. They let their actions speak for them, just as Petty Officer Chin did today." Dave nodded. "We won't make that mistake again, sir." "See that you don't," Commander Morrison replied. "And remember that there are thousands of men and women like Petty Officer Chun serving quietly around the world, protecting the freedoms that allow us to enjoy places like the shooting range. They deserve your respect, whether you know who they are or not." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah started packing up her equipment. She moved with the same quiet efficiency she had displayed all day, stowing her gear in organized fashion. Pete approached her one more time. "Petty Officer Chun, I want to thank you for the demonstration. And I want you to know that what happened earlier today has taught me something important about making assumptions." Sarah looked up from her packing. "What's that?" "That the most dangerous people are often the ones who don't look dangerous," Pete said. "And that the most impressive abilities are often held by the most humble people." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile Pete had seen from her all day. "That's a good lesson to learn," she said. "For what it's worth, you handled the situation well once you realized your mistake. Not everyone has the character to admit when they're wrong." "Thank you," Pete said. "And thank you for your service." "All of it. It's been my honor," Sarah replied simply. As Pete walked back to join Mike and Dave, he reflected on how dramatically the day had changed. They had come to the range expecting a normal afternoon of recreational shooting. Instead, they had received a lesson in humility, respect, and the hidden depths of the people around them. They had also witnessed something extraordinary, a glimpse into the world of elite military operations, demonstrated by someone who had earned her place among the most select warriors in the world. But The day wasn't over yet. Commander Morrison had something more to say, and Pete had the feeling that the lessons they had learned were about to be put to the test in an unexpected way. As Sarah finished packing her equipment, Commander Morrison gathered Pete, Mike, and Dave around her lane. The range had mostly returned to normal activity, but several people were still glancing over at their group with curiosity. Before we conclude this afternoon, the commander said, "I want to share something with you gentlemen. What you witnessed today wasn't just a shooting demonstration. It was a lesson in character." He gestured towards Sarah, who was securing her weapon case. Petty Officer Chen could have revealed her background the moment you made your first inappropriate comment. She could have embarrassed you in front of everyone here. Instead, she chose to simply demonstrate her abilities and let you draw your own conclusions. Pete nodded. "That showed a lot of restraint on her part, sir." "More than restraint," Commander Morrison corrected. "It showed leadership. In the SEAL teams, we have a saying, it pays to be a winner. But we also believe in winning with honor. Petty Officer Chun won today not by humiliating you, but by maintaining her professionalism while still making her point." Sarah looked up from her packing. "Sir, if I may, these gentlemen have handled the situation well since learning about their mistake. That says something about their character, too." Commander Morrison smiled slightly. "Well said, Petty Officer Chun. Which brings me to why I'm really here today." He turned to face the three men more directly. "I didn't come to this range by accident. I've been tracking reports of exceptional shooting, and Petty Officer Chen's practice sessions have been generating attention in the local military community." Mike looked confused. "Reports, sir." "The range manager is a former Navy Master Chief," Commander Morrison explained. "When he saw shooting like this from an unknown person, he made some inquiries. That's how I learned that one of my team members was practicing here." He paused for a moment, studying each of the three men. "But I also learned about the initial interaction you had with her. The range manager overheard some of your comments." Pete felt his face flush with embarrassment all over again. "That's why I decided to come personally," the commander continued. "I wanted to see how you would handle learning who she really was. I wanted to see if you were the kind of people who could learn from their mistakes." Dave spoke up. "And what's your assessment, sir?" "My assessment is that you made a serious error in judgment, but you owned up to it when confronted with the truth. That's more than many people would do." Commander Morrison's expression softened slightly. "More importantly, you've shown respect for Petty Officer Chen's service, and you've demonstrated that you can learn from this experience." Sarah had finished packing and was standing at a relaxed version of attention. "Sir, if I may make a suggestion?" "Of course, Petty Officer Chun. These gentlemen have military backgrounds," she said, nodding toward Pete. "And all of them have shown that they care about doing the right thing. Perhaps they could be allies rather than just people who learned a lesson." Commander Morrison raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" Sarah looked at Pete, Mike, and Dave. "The military community needs civilian support and understanding. People who recognize the value of service and who can help bridge the gap between military and civilian communities." Pete began to understand what she was suggesting. "You mean we could help other people avoid making the same mistake we made?" "Exactly," Sarah said. "Not everyone gets the opportunity to learn these lessons in a controlled environment like this. Most people never meet active duty SEALs or see demonstrations of military training. They make assumptions based on movies and television." Commander Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "That's an interesting perspective, Petty Officer Chun." "Sir," Pete said, "if there's any way we could help with that kind of outreach, we'd be honored to participate." Mike and Dave nodded their agreement. "There might be," the commander said. "We occasionally do community outreach programs, demonstrations at schools, talks to veteran organizations, participation in community events. People with your backgrounds could help facilitate those kinds of interactions." Sarah smiled. "It would help people understand that military service members are just people doing a job. We're not movie heroes, but we're also not what some people assume we are based on appearance or background. Like assuming a small woman couldn't be an elite warrior," Dave said with a rueful smile. "Exactly like that," Sarah agreed. Commander Morrison looked at his watch. "Gentlemen, I need to wrap this up, but I want you to consider what Petty Officer Chun has suggested. If you're serious about helping with community outreach, I can put you in touch with the appropriate people. He reached into his pocket and pulled out business cards. My contact information. If you decide you want to contribute to better civilian-military understanding, give me a call. Pete accepted the card gratefully. Thank you, sir. We'll definitely follow up on this. Good. Commander Morrison turned to Sarah. Petty Officer Chun, excellent work today on multiple levels. Your shooting was outstanding, and your handling of a difficult social situation was exemplary. Thank you, sir. I'll see you at the team briefing Monday morning. We have a new training cycle starting next week. I'll be there, sir. Commander Morrison nodded to Pete, Mike, and Dave. Gentlemen, it's been educational meeting you. I hope you'll take the lessons from today and use them to make positive contributions to your community. We will, sir, Pete promised. As Commander Morrison left the range, the 4 remaining people stood in a moment of comfortable silence. Well, Mike said finally, this has been the most educational shooting session I've ever had. Sarah laughed, a genuine, relaxed sound that was completely different from the professional demeanor she had maintained during the demonstration. It's been interesting for me, too. I don't usually end up giving tactical demonstrations to people I've just met. I'm glad it happened, though, Dave said. I learned something important about myself today. I learned that I make assumptions I shouldn't make. We all do, Sarah replied. The important thing is being willing to change when we learn better. Pete looked around the range, which had returned to normal activity. You know, I've been coming here for 3 years, and I thought I knew what good shooting looked like. What you showed us today was on a completely different level. Different training, different purpose, Sarah said. Competitive shooting and tactical shooting serve different needs. Both are valuable, but they're not the same thing. Could you teach us some of those techniques? Mike asked hopefully. Sarah considered the question. Some of them, maybe. The basic tactical shooting principles can be adapted for civilian use. But the advanced stuff requires training environments that aren't available to civilians. Whatever you could share would be appreciated, Pete said. And not just the shooting techniques. The way you handled the situation today, staying calm, maintaining professionalism, proving your point without being vindictive, that's something we could all learn from. That's just military training, Sarah said modestly. We're taught to stay calm under pressure and to focus on mission accomplishment rather than personal ego. Maybe, Dave said, but it's still impressive. Sarah began walking toward the exit, and the 3 men fell in a step beside her. So, Mike said, are you going to keep practicing here? Probably, Sarah said. It's convenient to the base, and the facilities are good. Plus, now I know there are some decent people here who won't judge me before they get to know me. Pete laughed. Well, we learned our lesson about judging people. I think you're safe from that happening again. As they reached the parking lot, Sarah turned to face the 3 men. I want you to know that I appreciate how you handled things once you realized your mistake. A lot of people would have gotten defensive or tried to make excuses. You owned up to it and apologized sincerely. That means something. Thank you, Pete said. And thank you for giving us the chance to make it right. Sarah got into her car, a modest sedan that looked like it could belong to any civilian. As she started the engine, she rolled down her window. I hope you'll follow up with Commander Morrison about the outreach programs, she said. The military needs allies in the civilian community, and you 3 could help bridge that gap. We will, Dave promised. And maybe we'll see you here again sometime. Count on it, Sarah said with a smile. I still have a lot of practice to do. As she drove away, Pete, Mike, and Dave stood in the parking lot, each processing the events of the day in their own way. You know, Mike said finally, I think this is going to change how I look at people. How so? Dave asked. I'm going to remember that everyone has a story I don't know about. Everyone has experiences and abilities that might not be obvious. I'm never going to make assumptions about someone based on how they look again. Pete nodded. I keep thinking about how easily we could have missed all of this. If we had just minded our own business from the beginning, we would have gone home today thinking we had a normal shooting session. We never would have learned what we learned. But we also wouldn't have made asses of ourselves, Dave pointed out. True, Pete agreed. But sometimes making mistakes is how we learn the most important lessons. I'd rather learn this lesson the hard way than not learn at all. As they got into their own vehicles, each man was thinking about how they would tell this story to their friends and families. It wasn't just a story about meeting a Navy SEAL or seeing impressive shooting. It was a story about assumptions, respect, humility, and the hidden depths of the people around them. It was a story about learning to see people for who they really are rather than who they appear to be at first glance. And it was a story they would remember every time they were tempted to make quick judgments about someone they didn't know. The shooting range afternoon had become something much more significant than any of them had expected when they woke up that morning. It had become a lesson that would influence how they interacted with people for the rest of their lives. Sarah Chun, Petty Officer First Class, United States Navy SEALs, had taught them something more valuable than marksmanship. She had taught them respect, humility, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to see the person underneath. It was a lesson worth learning, and they had learned it from one of the best teachers they could have asked for, someone who had earned the right to teach it through service, sacrifice, and the kind of character that defines true warriors. The mocking had stopped the moment they saw her shooting. The real education had begun when they met her as a person and learned what she represented. And that education would continue long after they left the shooting range that day. Sarah walked into the shooting range with her head held high, but her hands were shaking slightly. The smell of gunpowder and cleaning oil filled the air as she approached the counter. Behind her, she could hear the muffled sounds of gunshots from the indoor ranges. The clerk at the counter looked up from his paperwork. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes. "First time here?" he asked, glancing at Sarah's small frame and casual clothes. "Yes," Sarah replied softly. "I'd like to rent a lane for an hour, please." The man nodded and slid a clipboard across the counter. "Fill this out. Any experience with firearms?" Sarah hesitated for a moment. "Some," she said simply. As she filled out the paperwork, she noticed 3 men at a nearby table cleaning their guns. They were loud and confident, wearing tactical gear that looked expensive. Their conversation carried across the room. "Look at that," one of them said, nodding towards Sarah. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a buzz cut, another weekend warrior, thinking she can handle a real gun. His friends chuckled. The second man, shorter but stocky, shook his head. "Bet she's here because her boyfriend told her to learn. Probably thinks she can protect herself with a little .22." The third man, who had a thick beard and wore a military-style cap, grinned. $20, says she can't hit the target from 7 yards. Sarah pretended not to hear them as she handed back the paperwork. The clerk gave her a key and pointed toward lane 15. "That's your spot. Need any safety equipment?" "I have my own," Sarah said, patting the small bag she carried. As she walked toward her lane, the 3 men watched her go. The tall one with the buzz cut stood up and called out, "Hey, miss, you sure you don't want to start with a kiddie range? We got some cork guns in the back." His friends burst into laughter. Sarah stopped walking but didn't turn around. She could feel her face getting hot with embarrassment and anger. "Leave her alone, Mike," the clerk said from behind the counter, but his voice lacked any real authority. "Just being helpful," Mike replied with a smirk. "Don't want anyone getting hurt because they bit off more than they can chew." Sarah continued to her lane without responding. She set her bag down on the small shelf and began unpacking her equipment. Her ear protection was military grade, not the cheap plastic kind most casual shooters used. Her shooting glasses were professional quality. From her bag, she pulled out a case. Inside was a Glock 19, well-maintained and familiar. The weight of it in her hands felt right, like shaking hands with an old friend. The 3 men had moved to lanes nearby, apparently wanting to get a good view of what they expected to be entertainment. Mike was in lane 12, the stocky one named Dave was in 13, and the bearded man called Pete had taken lane 14. "What do you think she's got there?" Dave asked loudly, making no effort to hide his conversation. "Looks like she spent some money on it, at least." "Probably Daddy's gun," Pete said, loading his own pistol. "Rich girl playing dress-up." Sarah clipped the target to the line and sent it out to 25 yards. This drew more attention from the men. 25 yards. Mike laughed. Honey, you might want to bring that in a little closer. Most people start at 7 yards for a reason. Sarah put on her ear protection and ignored them. She took her shooting stance, and for the first time since entering the range, she felt completely calm. Her breathing slowed, her hands steadied, and everything else faded away. The first shot rang out, then the second, then the third. She fired 10 rounds in quick succession, each shot deliberate and controlled. When she was done, she pressed the button to bring the target back. The men had stopped talking. They watched as the target came back down the line towards Sarah. When it arrived, even from their positions, they could see the tight grouping in the center of the target. All 10 shots were clustered in the 10 ring, with most of them touching each other. Lucky shots, Mike said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. Dave squinted at the target. That's actually pretty good grouping. Pete was quiet, studying Sarah more carefully now. Something about the way she handled her weapon, the way she stood, was familiar to him. He'd served in the Army for 8 years before getting out, and he recognized certain things. Sarah sent the target out again, this time to 50 yards. The maximum distance for the indoor range. 50 yards, Dave said. Come on, that's just showing off now. Sarah loaded another magazine. This time she took her time, settling into a rhythm. She fired slowly, deliberately. Each shot was a conversation between her and the target. When she brought the target back, the result was even more impressive. At 50 yards, she had maintained a grouping that most people couldn't achieve at 25. The range had gotten quieter. Other shooters were starting to notice. Word was spreading among the regulars that someone was putting on a show in lane 15. Mike wasn't laughing anymore. Okay, that's actually impressive, he admitted grudgingly. Dave nodded. Yeah, I couldn't do that. But Pete was studying something else. As Sarah reached up to clip a new target to the line, her sleeve had ridden up slightly. On her forearm, he caught a glimpse of black ink. It looked like part of tattoo, but from his angle, he couldn't make out what it was. Sarah continued shooting, seemingly oblivious to the attention she was drawing. With each target, her groupings remained tight and precise. She moved through different distances and different shooting positions with the kind of fluid skill that only came from serious training. The mockery had stopped completely now. The 3 men were shooting their own targets, but they kept glancing over at Sarah's lane. Other people in the range were doing the same. I think we might have judged her wrong, Dave said quietly to his friends. Mike nodded slowly. Yeah, I think you're right. But Pete was still focused on that glimpse of tattoo he'd seen. Something about it nagged at him. He'd seen a lot of military tattoos over the years, and there was something specific about the style and placement that seemed familiar. As Sarah finished her first hour and went to the counter to extend her time, Pete made a decision. He was going to find out more about this mysterious woman who had just schooled them all at their own game. The clerk looked impressed as he processed Sarah's payment for another hour. You shoot competitively? He asked. Sometimes, Sarah replied, her voice still soft and humble. Well, you're certainly good at it, the clerk said. Best shooting I've seen in here in a long time. Sarah smiled slightly and headed back to her lane. She didn't notice Pete watching her carefully, trying to get a better look at whatever was on her arm. As she unpacked her equipment again, Pete casually moved closer. He pretended to be checking something at the ammunition counter, but his real goal was to get a better view. Sarah was focused on her gun, checking and cleaning it between shooting sessions. As she worked, her sleeve shifted again, and Pete got a clearer look at her forearm. What he saw made him freeze. It wasn't just any military tattoo. It was something specific, something that told a story about who this quiet woman really was. And if Pete was right about what he was seeing, then he and his friends had just made a very big mistake. Pete stood there for a long moment, staring. His mind was racing, trying to process what he was seeing and what it meant. He had to be wrong. There was no way this small, quiet woman could be what that tattoo suggested she was. But as he watched her handle her weapon with a kind of professional competence that couldn't be faked, he began to realize that maybe his first impression had been completely wrong. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Sarah loaded another magazine and prepared for her next round of shooting, completely unaware that she had just revealed something that would change everything. The afternoon at the shooting range was about to become much more interesting than anyone had expected.